Hello, I'm Chris Flischer, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel, an intelligent, lively discussion about astrology, art, and spiritual adventure. Timing is everything, and as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Join me as I explore concepts that allow us to broaden our view of the world. You'll hear interesting topics, meet fascinating guests, and discover who you really are. Using the time-tested practices of astrology, you'll learn how to accept change as the great wheel of life turns. Astrology, art, and spiritual adventure on Turning of the Wheel TV with Chris Flischer. Hello and welcome to Turning of the Wheel. My name's Chris Flischer. This is a show about astrology, art, and spiritual adventure, and today I'm going to be discussing the sign of Sagittarius. Sagittarius is one of the, it's a mutable fire sign. Mutability in astrology means the signs that are the most adaptive, they are the ones that occupy the 3rd, the 6th, the 9th, and the 12th houses in the zodiacal wheel. And Sagittarians, if you're born between November 22nd and December 20th, you are a Sagittarius. And you know you're a Sagittarius because you know what you like to do. Sagittarians, as a general rule, and most of what I'm talking about here, astrology, in order for it to become understood by all people, we have to approach it from very broad strokes, with very broad general terms, in order to get a delineation onto what the actual attributes of the sign are. When you drill down, you get more accuracy with the individual. When you have a Sagittarius, you know the birthplace and the birth time, then those characteristics will change somewhat and become far more unique, personal, and more granular to the individual. But as a general rule, most Sagittarians possess these certain characteristics that I'm about to tell you about. First of all, they are very adventurous. They are known for they're known to be the travelers, the wanderers. They're the ones who have they're the Rolling Stones of the world, right? The Rolling Stone gathers no moss. They're the ones that are always moving on. They love independence, but primarily, more than anything else, adventure is the one thing that really drives them on. They want to be out and about in adventure. So they love to travel, they love to study. Study is also a form of education, as is travel. Travel and education really together are mind-expanding ventures. So anything that brings you and introduces you to new material, introduces you to new ideas, new vistas, new concepts, those are all what would be considered to be broadening, educational, broad sweeping kinds of themes. And as a result, this is what the Sagittarian really likes. So if you know somebody who's a Sagittarius, born between November 22nd and December 20th, you will know this person to be this type of individual. Now, they may not be the ones that are always traveling because of what else is going on in their chart. But as a general rule, as I said to you many times, the idea, this is a broad-based theme. It's only when we drill down into the specifics of the unique individual that astrology becomes incredibly accurate. That's not to say that my description I'm going to give you of Sagittarius isn't accurate. It is indeed accurate, but they're much broader. When we drill into the individual, and like, for example, if you came to me and had your chart done by me, I would need your birth date, your birthplace, and your birth time. My website is turningofthewheel.com. You can get there. There's a contact button for me there. And soon that will be updated, and we'll be looking at a much better, easier way to get a hold of me. When you do that and you give me those specifics, you may be a Sagittarius, but you're going to have a lot more granularity based on the time of birth, which I said many times before, orients the chart in ways that makes it more granular and unique to you. So that's what's most important. But getting on to the Sagittarius, they are, as I said, they're very adventurous. They have lots of restless energy. They love personal independence. This is one thing you'll find out if you've ever been married to one or if you're involved with one. They need their breathing room, and they are happiest when they are on the go. So when they're moving through the world, that's when they're happiest. It's what they want to do. They enjoy it. They love travel. They love education. And essentially, all of these concepts that I'm talking about, if you think about them in a broad-based term, are all about escaping, okay? When you're traveling, you're escaping the humdrum of your daily life. When you are in school, you're broadening your mind. And this is also the same component we find in Sagittarians as a general rule. Almost always we will see this is the case. Another interesting characteristic of the Sagittarian is that they love to be they're very spiritually motivated. There's a strong sense of spirituality, which again I think ties into that same theme of being able to expand, to elaborate, to reach out and be somebody different, and to sort of push the envelope, always striving for something new. It's kind of typical of a fire sign. You know, fire signs are, and all Sagittarians typically get along with fire signs. Like, for example, I'm an Aries fire sign. My two best friends are a Sagittarius and a Leo, both fire signs. So this is what we see, this commonality. We see there's a certain recognition that other fire signs will have with Sagittarians. Like I said, the Leos and the Aries will find a certain kind of passion, a certain kind of interest, a real characteristic that speaks to who they are as individuals. You'll see it all the time in friendships, and you'll see it if you see the rising sign is Sagittarius and the individual is a Sagittarius, the other individual, that combination of the two, you'll always see that kind of synergy happening there as well. So Sagittarius Sun will match up with a Sagittarius rising or a Sagittarius moon, and the same is true for the Aries Sun, the Aries moon, the Leo Sun, the Leo moon, the Leo rising, the Aries rising. And because it's a fire sign, they will also typically get along with Geminis, which is an air sign, Libras, and Aquarius, also air signs. So fire feeds air, air feeds fire, very much the case. We're going to go through what it looks like if you have a sun in each of the individual houses that circle the zodiac, and then I'm going to get into some of the famous characters that who are Sagittarius that you will definitely recognize. Famous people, I think, really illustrate the characteristics of the sign more than anything else, because we relate to them in a certain way. If we see a famous politician, or we see a religious leader, or we see somebody who's traveled, the great explorers, we know that this is a Sagittarius trait, and what makes a lot of sense to be able to see that happening. So this is very important. But they are that expansive kind of person. They're the kind of people who love adventure, they love to take off, and I said they are rolling stones who gather no moss. So people who have that aspect, very friendly, very affable, mutable signs in general. I'm always speaking in generalities. Mutable signs. So there's 4 mutable signs. There is Gemini, there is Virgo, there is Sagittarius, and there is Pisces. Sagittarius is the fire component of the mutability. And in that capacity, they have the ability to be the leaders in some ways, very affable, but also very adaptable. Mutable signs tend to adapt. This is what's really important about them. They adapt to others. So if you're in a relationship with a mutable sign, one of those 4 signs I just mentioned, and you're a fixed sign, for example, you might find that your way typically is the way that things go, because of the simple fact that you are more adaptable. So the Sagittarius are adaptable. Now let's just go through what it's like. Now, when I talk about the sun in different houses, that is determined by the birth time. The time of birth. And this is important. Not all birth certificates have the time of birth, but if the birth time is there and it's accurate, even if it's within an hour or 2, we can get a very good idea of the layout of the astrology chart. That sets the baseline for the astrology chart. Once that is set, we can determine where the highlights of the individual are within that circular wheel. If you need more information, you can always contact me. I do teach classes on astrology to help people understand. My website is turningofthewheel.com. and you'll find out quite a bit. So let's start out with a Sagittarius. If you have a Sagittarius rising or Sagittarius in the first house, you are going to be the epitome of all those things I just mentioned. You're going to be the adventurer. You're going to be the traveler. You're going to be the one that's out there. You're the one that's going to be, in many ways, you are a pioneer, because the traveler, in some ways, you think about it, the traveler is always open to new ideas, always looking. Even though we think of the Aries as the one that is the first one out the door, going to charging and being the leader of the pack, it's the Sagittarius fire sign that really brings in that sense of adventure and that desire to expand, and always perpetually curious is a good word, I would say, very much like the Gemini, which is the opposite side of the zodiac wheel. When you look at the wheel, that's the opposite side. And Sagittarius and Geminis typically tend to be good partners, because they recognize that curious excitement of travel and constant change, which is very good. If you've got Sagittarius in the second house is the house of money, whereas the first house is the house of self. The second house of money is where you would express yourself by means of money, being a very creative money organizer, being an adventurer with money, being perhaps a person who educates about money, taking someone who might be a world hedge fund manager, for example. That's where you would see the ability for Sagittarius to come to fruition. You'd see that great sense of willing to experiment and willing to travel and willing to explore new ideas with regard to how to manage money and resources. So it's not just money per se, it's not just stacks of bills, it's also resources. So resources can be groceries, they can be water, they can be building materials, anything like that is also the case. When we get to Sagittarius Sun in the third house is the house of communication. This is where we might see the traveling journalist. This is where we might see the person who loves to stand in front of the microphone and talk. This is the person who likes to educate through research and writing. We'll see some writers who have this strong ability, who like to have this characteristic of teaching. This is the area of teaching. We see it. The third house is directly opposite the ninth house, which is the house of education and travel, the house that Sagittarius rules. So it's important that we see that there. And I think communication is key. You might find people who are the Sagittarius Sun in the broadcast medium. You might see them as writers. You might see them as journalists, photographers, anything that sort of expresses in form of communication. This is a communicative position in the zodiac wheel, very highly regarded and highly, very typical for a traveling journalist. This would be a great spot for a photojournalist, for example. Somebody out taking pictures around the world, sending them in back to the home office for the daily paper. That's the sort of place you'd find that. Sagittarius in the fourth house finds the Sagittarian, even though the fourth house is typically the house of the home and the environment and the domestic bliss, we might find somebody who travels around in a motorhome, because rather than being home and stable, they bring the home with them. I'm sort of joking in that regard, but it can be the case that a Sagittarius would be comfortable on the road traveling, although they still would devote some time back home. It's important that they do provide that. One thing that you have to remember about a Sagittarius is that because they are so footloose and fancy-free, they tend to wander, and in that wandering, they tend to ignore the home. So if you have a Sagittarius with a fourth house, with the sun in the fourth house, very good place for it, because they're going to sort of ground them more. As I said, there's a lot more to astrology than just the sun sign. That's the point I'm trying to make. When we see the Sagittarius in the fifth house is the house of creativity. It's the house of children. This is where children come in. This is where we sort of see that innocence come to pass. We have innocence as sort of, the ability to let your hair down and be creative and sort of, wander and be adventurous. Almost everything a Sagittarius does will be laced with some form of adventure. So when it's adventure and it comes to the home, to the sign, to the house of the fifth house, which is the house of creativity, you're going to see enormous ability for them to create, and they may reach out very far in their ability to create. They may travel to create. Part of traveling may be how they create, or they may create as a result of traveling. Both work in both cases. When we turn to the sixth house is the house of service. And service is often misconstrued as being a servant. It's not a servant, it's servants. Service is the house of lawyers, doctors, dentists, hygienists, people who take care of others. Doesn't necessarily mean that you're a waitress, not that there's anything wrong with being a waitress. People have to be served. It's a viable occupation. But the Sagittarius in the sixth house is one who's going to serve others. You might find a religious person here, for example, or someone who does a great deal of work to help others. This is where service is very important. And service is perhaps one of the most divine gifts anybody can give to anybody else, is to serve another person. And we all have to serve somebody, as Bob Dylan has always said. We all got to serve somebody. And so that's something to consider. Now, the next house we find is Sagittarius in the seventh house. The seventh house is the house of relationships. Now, relationships are those primarily dictated by your primary relationship, which would mean your significant other, your wife, your husband, those people. They tend to find themselves matching up with people who are like-minded or who have that ability to understand them and allow them that room that they need to move. So, as I mentioned, oftentimes in astrology, we find some of the best arrangements for marriages occurs between the rising sign and the sun of the other, or the rising sign and the moon, especially if they are in the opposite sign. So Sagittarius with a Gemini moon might do very well. Sagittarius with a Gemini rising might do very well. That's where you get that commonality very clearly, and it really does enhance that. And they are also the Sagittarius needs to find a spouse or a partner that allows them that freedom, allows them that ability to expand, allows them to feel as if they are, not tied down, not encumbered, not bound by, because that love of independence, that love of freedom is really, really critical for them. They need to have that, and it's important that they have that. Otherwise, they become very restless, and they may depart. Just something to consider. If you've got a Sagittarius, give them lots of room. If you've got a Sagittarius in your life, give them a lot of room. The next house we move to is the 8th house. The 8th house is typically the house of sex and death. I always say that every time, but sex and death does not mean literally that. It just means regeneration. This is where we find somebody who has been beaten down and maybe rises from the ashes. It's a very spiritual, it's a very mystic house. It's the house that's ruled by Scorpio, actually, but Sagittarius, if the sun is in Sagittarius in the 8th house, you're going to find somebody who has lofty ideas, who is very much involved with mysticism, and may, travel the world to find that. They may branch out and see if they can find that somewhere in their lives. The next house we come to is the house that Sagittarius rules, which is the 9th house. 9th house is, and by the way, Sagittarius, if I didn't mention it before, is ruled by Jupiter. Jupiter is that planet right behind me, which is the planet representative of abundance, optimism, expansion, progression, inflation, all of those things, all things that are big and large and grand. So this is very much the case with Jupiter. And Sagittarius, when Sagittarius is, the Sagittarius sun is in the 9th house, it is in the house that it rules. So therefore it is highly aspected, and therefore it's sitting in very good company. So there we would find the person who may very well be the traveler, the diplomat. This is where we might find the teacher, the person who spends the time teaching and instructing others. And also we might find people with deep spiritual roots here. We might find a cardinal there, or a minister, or someone like that, a religious figure who does well with that broad sweeping terms that the Sagittarius comes to admire so much. When we go to the 10th house is the house of career. So if we found a Sagittarius sun in the 10th house, we would find somebody who is more inclined towards perhaps in the travel industry, maybe an airline pilot, maybe a sea merchant, or a naval person who travels the world or a pilot. All of those worlds are very highly regarded. Also, again, it's very good for leadership with regard to travel, education. You might find someone who's a Sagittarius within the educational realm of a university, for example. This is very important where you'd find this to be the case. So very highly motivated in that regard, especially if the business that they're in involves all of those things I mentioned before: travel, education, expansion. All those things are very important. When we come to the 11th house, as I've mentioned in the past, is the house of groups and business associates. This is where we would find collaboration. Now, typically, the Sagittarian is a very good collaborator because they do well, and again, that comes back to that idea I mentioned at the beginning, the mutability. Mutability means adaptability. It means that they are willing to adapt. They are willing to comply with others rather than, stand off, or rather than pushing back. They are more willing to let people in to try to work out some sort of a compromise. This is a very diplomatic place for a partner. And it is where they all work within a group. So you'd find like-minded people working within groups. This is an excellent spot for the Sagittarius. When we look at the 12th house is the very last house in the zodiac wheel. It's the house of transition. Transition often scares people because they think of the term of, leaving this mortal plane and moving on to the next one. And that is true, that is a transition, but so is a pregnancy. I've mentioned this many times before. The end of a pregnancy is a transition. It is the birth of a child. Not all transitions need be dangerous or scary. There has to be this certain quality of letting go, being willing to take new chances. You think about it, it's fairly natural in some ways for a Sagittarius to be comfortable there. Even though that house is typically ruled by Pisces. Pisces is another mutable sign, it's a water sign. But Sagittarius does well there because if they're always looking for something new, some new form of excitement, some new form of expansion, some new form of reaching out and being something different, transition is a great spot for them to look because they're always trying to find something new. It's that sense of restlessness. So they may very well seek to turn over their lives many times. This might be very much the case. Interesting to be able to have that as a character trait because we see that so clearly with regard to how they begin and start again. Now, what I want to do for the last few minutes here is discuss some famous Sagittarius. This is the way that I think that the whole idea of astrology becomes remarkably accurate because we're going to see these people that we know of very well. These are high-profile public figures who are either historically relevant or they're currently in the mainstream. But we'll be able to see that type of adventure in them, either in the way that they express themselves via their art, or whether they express themselves in the way of their jobs, or whatever. Interestingly enough, one of the people I had mentioned earlier, who is very well known, who really sort of epitomizes the archetypal type of Sagittarian, is none other than Pope Francis. Now, Pope Francis is a world leader, so he fits that category, but he's also a spiritual leader. He's also pushing things further down the road. He's really quite an initiator when it comes to the idea of pushing the Catholic Church further. Very interesting character. He is a real unifier. He's a traveler. He's a person willing to look at different ideas. And again, that spiritual component, which is so much a part of Sagittarius, is there in that persona of him. He's just one of many. Another person who's interesting on my list here is Winston Churchill. Now, Winston Churchill was the Prime Minister of England all throughout the course of World War II. He was a remarkably consistent, tenacious person. I'm sure his rising sign was something that was much more earthbound than the air, than the fire of the Sagittarius. But he was one who was willing to expand. He was willing to speak out and move on. Also, in order to be in a position such as that at the time, he had to work with Franklin Roosevelt. He had to work with Joseph Stalin. They had to have some sort of ability. Now, Franklin Roosevelt was an Aquarius. I think Stalin was a Capricorn, so maybe there wasn't quite the same sort of synergy there, although being able to be in that situation, you would find that and Churchill's relationship with Franklin Roosevelt was fairly good. They had that fire and air combination going that kept their conversations lively, and they sought to change the world. These are people that changed the world. I mean, literally, you can't take that away from them. They denied the world. Another famous person you'll find interesting is Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra was a Sagittarius. And it sort of makes sense when you think of who he is and how he got around. And, you know, he has that very smooth kind of luster, very animated kind of guy who likes to get out there and enjoys the stage and all that. And it's kind of fun because he was a very affable kind of character. Now, granted, he had his moments, as we all know. But as a rule, very affable, sort of a very compliant kind of guy, friendly, and well-liked by millions, and left his mark, and yet he was a sort of a rambler. I mean, he didn't stay still for very long, so that sort of epitomizes that again. Another interesting character who I'm reading a book about right now is Mark Twain. And Mark Twain, people didn't realize this, but he was a very, very famous traveler. He spent years traveling. He even wrote a book called Journey Around the Equator, which details, and at some point in his life, he was very, very late in his life, he was in his late 50s, realized that he was bankrupt and had to go out and travel the world. This was in the late 1800s. Had to travel the world by boat, by train, by elephant, however he could, all around. He circumnavigated the globe in an effort to do speaking engagements in order to raise money to pay off his considerable debts. He was not very good with money, unfortunately. So that's one of the things that we have to take into account. Another interesting one of the more famous of Sagittarians is Walt Disney. Now, we all know of Walt Disney as Disney Productions nowadays, but back in the day, back when I was growing up, Walt Disney was the man who invented Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, all those cartoon characters, brought them to life. Very, very vivid imagination, but always pushing the envelope, always trying to get out there and had this big, huge global view. He thought nothing would stop him. Very much of a Jupiterian kind of guy. When I say Jupiter, I mean optimistic, abundant, inflated, kind of grand, larger than life, all these people I've mentioned in larger life. Pope Francis, Winston Churchill, Mark Twain, Frank Sinatra, all larger than life characters. And this is, that sort of that wanderlust, that independent streak, that desire to be unique is all very present there. Now we get into some more current names, things that maybe you'll perhaps recognize better. We'll see people like Taylor Swift. Taylor Swift and Britney Spears. Taylor Swift and Britney Spears are both Sagittarius. So you think about them. Well, how do they make their living? They make their living by getting out and traveling. This is what they do. They travel. There's a certain desire to travel. They need to travel. This is what they live and breathe on. And Jay-Z as well. Jay-Z. So we have Taylor Swift, Britney Spears, and Jay-Z, and Miley Cyrus, by the way, all strong entertainers, all out there in this area of this realm. These are all 4 current pop stars who are very highly regarded and understand the idea of what it means to get out and reach the audience. But their lives are spent traveling. They travel. They travel and travel and travel, and they keep on with that sense of searching for a new form of expression, searching for a new way to relate to people, searching for new things that can bring them together and make their lives more expansive. It's that sense of restlessness. You'll find that if you live within a Sagittarius, you know one very well, they are restless. They have a difficult time sitting still sometimes. They want to keep moving. They want to do things. They want to get things done. They're sort of goal-oriented. But again, as I said at the beginning, if you're born between November 22nd and December 20th, you are a Sagittarius. You are ruled by the planet Jupiter, which is the one behind me there, right behind my head. And it is the one that is the planet of expansion, optimism, abundance. All of those characteristics come to light under the Sagittarius individual and the Sagittarius wheel. Of course, they are born late in the year, and it comes into the time when we get closer to the winter solstice, which we'll be talking about when I get to the Capricorn section. But I think overall you'll see that this is an individual who has this wanderlust, this desire to expand, this endless, bottomless curiosity, which can only be satisfied by travel, by reading, by education, by spiritual pursuit. All of these areas are highly regarded areas for the Sagittarius. They are adventurous, restless energy, positive independence. They love personal independence. There's the sense of being very adaptive, where they're able to comply with others. That's the sort of what I mentioned earlier as the mutability. Mutability as a characteristic is nice. We have our fire, we have our cardinal signs which start things, we have our fixed signs which sort of do all the hard work in the middle, and then we have our mutable signs which sort of come along and clean up at the end. They're the sort of the ones that are adaptable, and they sort of put all the pieces together at the very end and sort of tidy the room up, so to speak. There's that quality. This happens with all mutable signs. There's 4 mutable signs: Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, and Pisces. Sagittarius is the fire component of that. Each of those 4 mutable things, as I mentioned, have a distinct element associated with them. So again, Sagittarius, a remarkably interesting sign: warm, friendly, engaging, adventurous, carefree, freedom-loving, endlessly curious, loves to travel, loves independence, and can be a wonderful asset to anybody's family. They do well with other fire signs, Aries and Leo, and they also do well with air signs, because air feeds fire. So Gemini, Libra, and Aquarius would also do well in that particular realm. So they're really, really critical pieces of the zodiac wheel, and they sort of balance out. They're ruled by Jupiter. They are the ruler of the 9th house, and they are wonderful people to know. Hopefully you've got one in your house, in your life somewhere. And thanks, and we'll be back to talk about more signs soon.